Hello and welcome to the FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're going to discuss our latest lawsuit challenging an unconstitutional property tax exemption right here in our home city of Madison, Wisconsin. Joining me in studio is FFRF staff attorney Sammi Lawrence. Hello, Sammi.
Hello, Liz. It's great to be here as always.
Yes, and as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today, so you can leave your questions in the chat below, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer questions live during the show. So let's get into it. Our latest lawsuit was filed by FFRF and 3 local Madison residents. The case is challenging a property tax exemption that the state legislature handcrafted to benefit 2 church-owned student housing complexes here in Madison, the Press House and Lumen House. So these are not places of worship, even though they're owned by the church. They are basically luxury apartments, but they're allowed to operate tax-free simply because they're owned by these specific religious organizations. So it is really unfair to Madison taxpayers like us, and we're going to try to break down and explain what's going on here, why it's unfair, and why FFRF sued.
So, like you alluded to, this special property tax exemption, this has been on FFRF's radar for years, and we're glad that we finally were able to get things together to bring this challenge. For our audience, I'm sure they know this, but just to make it clear, every time a city like Madison removes property from the tax rolls, that means all the other property tax owners basically have to pay more to make up for that.
Right.
So because these 2 apartment complexes are not paying property taxes, everyone here, including our plaintiffs, have to pay more. And this exemption, the way it's written and the way it came about, violates specifically Wisconsin state constitution for a number of reasons, including by giving special treatment to these 2 properties that are owned by religious organizations. So a pretty clear state church issue.
Right. So, like you said, at FFRF here, we have long been following this tax exemption. It sort of has a history that goes back years. But for those who are just learning about this with news of our lawsuit, Sammi, let's break down so people can understand why this is such an unusual and unfair privilege. And let's just start with, how did this tax exemption come about? How is it different from just church property tax exemption?
So this tax exemption was literally specifically created to benefit the Press House apartments, which are owned by the Presbyterian Student Center Foundation here in Madison. And for anyone who hasn't been to the city of Madison, the UW-Madison campus is huge. It's located downtown on our isthmus near the Capitol, and real estate here is like a prime commodity. So the Press House apartments are this large building that sits basically in the heart of campus. The land itself, even if nothing was on it, is worth millions of dollars. And the Presbyterian Student Center Foundation bought and renovated these apartments back in the late 2010s, and for some reason they thought that these apartments would be tax exempt just because they are owned by a religious nonprofit. So the first year that they opened, the Press House apartments paid property taxes, and they paid about $160,000 in property taxes in 2008, 2009, so over 10 years ago now. And at that time, they were unhappy about paying property taxes, and they got a Democrat in the Wisconsin legislature to propose and write this special tax exemption, and that representative at the time, Spencer Black, literally told Madison media that he proposed this exemption because he thought the Press House apartment should be tax exempt. So it was written in this very specific way that only was meant to benefit the Press House apartments.
Right. So it's a special bill passed by the legislature that does everything but name the press house specifically, right? Like it describes the property without getting super in the weeds. It's statutory language. It describes the eligible property in a way that can basically only apply to this particular building. And let's just remind people that it's not normal for like for-profit enterprises owned by nonprofits or churches to be tax exempt. So we all know that churches and 501c3s are customarily tax exempt for the property where they do their charitable business. So this building, Freethought Hall, is exempt from property taxes. So are all of the churches, houses of worship, and places that are being primarily used for charitable purposes, of which the churches are huge property owners in Madison and in cities all across the country. So, but anybody who owns a rental property, which is an investment, it is a money-making investment property, pays taxes on their property, because that is not a charitable use of property that the rest of taxpayers are willing to and supposed to subsidize. So for example, if you are just an enterprising landlord here in Madison and you own a building with flats in it, or you own a big luxury apartment building, you pay property taxes on that, and you have no hope of ever getting an exemption from paying those property taxes on your investment rental property.
Yeah, exactly. For obvious reasons,
Right.
we don't want to be subsidizing people's money-making ventures. And actually, in 2011, a Republican-led Joint Finance Committee here in Wisconsin actually voted to repeal this tax exemption because they agreed that we shouldn't be giving apartments tax-exempt status just because a religious organization happens to be the owner. And Scott Walker, our governor at the time, vetoed that. And then in 2013, the Catholic Church, the Diocese of Madison, purchased a rental property, the Lumen House Apartments, and they renovated that. And they found out that the legislature was going to amend this tax exemption to basically put effectively like a date on it. So they were going to amend it to say, and they did amend it to say, you have to meet all of these really, really specific requirements and exist and be doing this by, I think it's July 2nd, 2013. And the Lumen House Apartments weren't going to be ready by then. So the Catholic Church paid a lobbyist over, I think, $14,000 to lobby the legislature to make it so that the Lumen House Apartments would still be tax exempt. So the statute says you have to meet all the requirements by July 2013, unless you are opening your apartments in a municipally designated historical landmark, and then you have to meet them by September 30th, 2014. And guess what happened to open to tenants in September 2014?
Was it the Lumen House?
Yeah, it was the Lumen House. Isn't that crazy?
What
It
a
was the Lumen
coincidence.
House Apartments.
Right. So again, the bill was amended, or the law was amended, to specifically apply to basically what the legislature envisioned as only the Lumen House, and not and in a very strange thing for a law, not have any prospective effect on anybody in the future, but only be retroactively applied to these buildings that are in existence as of the dates that are in the amended bill. So they are very specifically written to target, for exemption, these two properties.
Yes, exactly, which is a problem for a variety of reasons, including under our state constitution. In our lawsuit, we make several different claims. Probably the one that might be the most obvious to our viewers is this is clearly a preference for these two religious organizations, religious organizations. The Wisconsin Constitution, like a lot of states, has a clause that is our version of the Establishment Clause, basically, and ours says that you can't give special preference and favoritism to religion or to specific groups within one religion. So we're saying that, like, clearly this was created to benefit these two organizations, and it is benefiting them to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, based
per
on
year.
Yeah,
Right,
per
over
year.
years. So let's just kind of take the most typical knee-jerk reactions that we've heard about our opposition to this law. So number one, what about the idea that, like, maybe a charitable organization like a church could run, you could imagine a church running housing that still fulfilled the charitable purposes requirement. What about that?
I would say that depending on the law and the situation, that seems very fact specific and we'd have to look at that. But here, that's not what's happening. Just to be clear, these apartments are renting to people at market rate.
Right.
So and here in Madison, downtown, right on next to campus, we're talking, you know, a one-bedroom apartment starting at like $1,500, $1,600, $2,000 a month. Like,
Right.
This is not reduced rents or affordable housing in any way. They are renting at the same rates as privately owned luxury apartments here.
Right. Market rate, basically student off-campus luxury apartments.
Yeah.
Is what we're talking about here. So just a rental business that happens to have two churches as landlords.
Yes.
Well, okay. So let's kind of talk a little bit about some of the kind of, they have a legal application in the lawsuit, but let's just talk kind of in layperson's terms about some of the unfairness here. We alluded to this before, and this is part of our lawsuit because we have some individual plaintiffs. There are plenty of people who own rental properties in Madison, and part of competing in that, industry is paying taxes on your property, right? Like that, your profits are limited by the cost of maintaining and owning, which includes taxes on your property. And there are no, rental properties outside the confines of this special bill that rent, market rate for-profit apartments that could hope to get tax exemptions. And that includes, big, huge property management companies or property companies that own, big luxury apartment buildings, but also, individuals who have some investment properties. Like maybe we have a lot of kind of old houses and bungalows that have been converted into flats that rent to students and others in Madison. And they are being really unfairly treated unfavorably compared to these two other random rental property owners that happen to be churches.
Yeah, exactly. And it just creates this really weird, unfair playing field for no reason other than the legislature decided that these two organizations deserve this special benefit for some reason. Because normally we do not do this with our tax laws in most states, and specifically here in Wisconsin. We generally have this principle of tax uniformity. Different classes should all within that class be taxed equally. So rental properties should all be taxed the same.
Right.
And the legislature does have the power to create property tax exemptions like it has for churches and nonprofits. But those exemptions still have to be constitutional, and they can't just create arbitrary groups. So they can't just arbitrarily decide all rental properties will be taxed the same except for you two special properties because we say so.
Right. Right, exactly. And kind of along those lines of like uniformity, not just in tax code, but in general in like American legislative traditions, we don't really tolerate private bills. And private bills are laws that are passed by legislatures that specifically target an individual or a business or an organization and confer rights or privileges or responsibilities on just an individual. Like the legislature passes a law that just says Sammi gets, $20,000. Like,
I would love that law.
I love that for you, but that's not the way our legislatures work. So private bills or bills like this that are getting really close to private bills, describing like with specificity property specifically in one part of the state that, has all of these limitations that basically zero in on a couple of properties, is really unusual just in terms of what we expect our legislature to do with its power.
Yeah, exactly. And here, too, something that's notable is that it literally can only apply in Madison because one of the requirements of this law is the properties have to be renting to at least 90% students attending the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It says that in the law, University of Wisconsin-Madison students, so no other UW students. For anyone who doesn't know, there are many UW campuses throughout our state, but this literally only applies to UW-Madison students, so it can only apply here. And that's a big problem because besides favoring specific individuals or companies or groups, our laws aren't supposed to just target one city or one location. Our laws are supposed to have to do with the entire state, be a matter of like statewide policy and issue. And obviously this isn't. Like a tax exemption that only benefits Madison properties has nothing to do with anyone else in our state.
Right. And again, this is not a municipal law. This is a state law passed by the Wisconsin legislature. And Sammy's right. Like, we don't expect a tax law to only apply, passed by the state of Wisconsin to only apply to be limited geographically to properties. By its language, it can only include properties basically located in Madison. And the reason why one of those limiting principles includes a quota of UW-Madison students is one of the legislature's way of zeroing the bill in on one specific entity and creating just like a geographical unfairness in terms of just equal protection under the law. Like Presbyterian church organization in, upstate Wisconsin that wants to get in on the action doesn't apply for this either. So, I mean, it's treating a specific church denominational group, both geographically and, in a sectarian way, favorably, which is really unfair and problematic and unequal and just bizarre.
Yeah, exactly. It's, besides being unfair, it's just like such a weird waste of time for our state legislature too. Personally, I think they should focus on things that actually have to do with the entire state and not properties that they happen to particularly like.
Right. It is totally just, it's just rank corruption. It's like exactly what you don't want your state legislature doing with their power, zeroing in on like specific things in their own lives and in their own, like, oh, I really have some connection with the press house or the Presbyterian church on campus. And so I'm going to use my legislative power to protect or privilege that group and that entity. It's just like exactly what feels totally corrupt and like furthers this like mistrust and this feeling of like lack of fairness around our tax laws, which we all know are already extremely preferential to churches and religious organizations. Let's talk a little bit about that because we're putting this in a context of not only is this like totally unfair and non-uniform and privileging of these two individual religious organizations, it's kind of made a lot more rich in the context of how much preference and privilege these organizations already enjoy under the tax code.
Yeah, exactly. The Lumen House, owned by the Catholic Church. I mean, don't even have to get into the storied, centuries-long history of the Catholic Church finding ways to evade taxes and get more money and all of the things that they already own and special exemptions that they and other churches get. I mean, there's a point where it's like, how much cake do you really need to have and eat to? Like, leave something for other people.
Right. Or you could stay out of the landlord business, right? Like, that's an option too. Like, we as a nonprofit, like, we don't expect that we could pick up a luxury apartment building and rent it tax-free and just make buku money without paying any taxes. That would be amazing, but that's not an option that's open to us. And I think that seems right with tax policy in terms of what we want to ask our fellow taxpayers to subsidize. And let's talk a little bit about the tax privileges that we as 501c3s, along with churches, already do enjoy. Like we said in the beginning, we do enjoy property tax exemption on our buildings where we actually do our charitable operations. This office building, places of worship, church offices that are auxiliary to places of worship, all of these places where churches can credibly claim to be doing their charitable work, they're already tax exempt. But other privilege of being a church or religious organization, unlike 501c3s like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, churches actually don't have to provide financial accounting to the IRS or often to state tax entities, because they have exemption not only from paying taxes, but from filing tax forms. They don't file Forms 990 with the IRS because they're exempt from that, even though other 501c3s are not. So they don't have to undergo the onerous and often costly, because this is often not something you can do without paying for outside auditing, the onerous and costly process of actually accounting for your finances to the IRS to remain in good stead and remain with the privilege of tax exemption, because you're showing that your money is being used for charitable purposes. So that's already a huge privilege, a huge burden that churches are exempt from in the first place for their charitable tax exemptions, such as property tax exemption on their actual primary charitable purpose plants.
Yeah, exactly. And even beyond property taxes, I mean, churches are exempt from all kinds of taxes.
Right.
In Wisconsin, we have an exemption for religious organizations that meet certain requirements. They can be exempt from our unemployment taxes.
Right.
Other states have something similar. Like, the idea that these churches bought rental properties that are money-making ventures and thought we should have an exemption just because we're churches and we own them is ridiculous, especially in context of all of the favoritism that they quite frankly already receive.
Right. And it really is just a slap in the face to other taxpayers who are already subsidizing our charitable buildings and places of worship and things like that, to say you should also subsidize our investment or rental investment properties is pretty bold and asking a lot of your fellow taxpayers.
Yeah, it is, especially in Madison and other state capitals that hold a lot of government-owned buildings. We here already the amount of properties that are taxed here is relatively low, because in Madison, so many of these properties here are owned by the state government, the county government, the city of Madison, schools, UW-Madison, a huge portion of campus, the hospital system is all tax exempt. So
Right.
every time the legislature creates these goofy, unnecessary tax exemptions to benefit churches or groups that it likes, it's reducing our tax base even more, and everyone else has to pay even more in property taxes to just keep things running.
That's right. So we've talked about the unfairness. We've talked about where this tax exemption comes from. So we just filed this lawsuit. Again, it's in state court because it's a Wisconsin challenge under Wisconsin law. And there's, you see Dan and Annie Lori Gaylor, who are our co-presidents and also our plaintiffs in this lawsuit. Why don't you just kind of give a snapshot of what's next for the lawsuit and when we'll know updates?
So like Lisa said, it was just filed not even quite 2 weeks now. So all of the parties have been served, which means they've been notified of the lawsuit, and we are currently just waiting for their legal answers or for motions that they file in response to the lawsuit. So we expect to have those sometime in March, and then where we go from there will kind of depend on what the other parties are arguing and what they choose to do. So just stay tuned for updates, subscribe to our emails, and check out our website to follow along with that.
Yeah, we'll know more later this year, and this will be, kind of a pretty bulky state court lawsuit because it involves the city of Madison. It will inevitably, involve government entities responding in addition to the religious organizations that are involved. So watch this space, and now we'll see if we have any audience questions and update you later this year on the lawsuit. All right, let's see. Okay. This is a good question. If this law were struck down, that'd be amazing. Do you anticipate, or would you anticipate, a reaction to push for a more broad law that would allow a similar exemption? What do you think? That would be hard. I think there's a reason why the legislature did it this way.
Yeah.
I think it would be really hard to justify a broader tax exemption that encompassed investment rental property.
Yeah, I think an exemption that it would basically just have to be an exemption that says if you're a nonprofit and you buy investment rental properties, those get to be tax exempt. And I think that would just be wild.
Right.
I personally don't think the legislature would do that. And I don't genuinely think the majority of voters or constituents in Wisconsin would want that.
Right.
I don't know. I don't think so.
Particularly tax-paying property owners. I would say, I would just kind of caveat that there are a lot of different ways that if the law were struck down or held unconstitutional by the court, there are a lot of ways that could be done. So there could be objections to, there could be a world where it was too narrowly written, but it could still be narrowly written, but it would be broader than it is currently. So I don't want to kind of discount what's possible when you really want to privilege churches. But I do think you can see by the way this was done how reluctant the legislature was to allow rental property writ large or any broader than this to be tax exempt for the reasons that Sammi is just outlining. We have a relatively, in Madison, even relative to other places, we have a relatively limited property tax base, which means our property taxes are quite high here. We do have a ton of government entities here. We're a state capital. We have a massive state university. And so there's not a lot of property. Once you start creating broad exemptions to some of these, rental properties and investment properties, you're really you're really cutting into an important part of the tax base. So I think there's a reason why this law was written in the way that it was in the first place. Here's another good question that has to do with kind of hypotheticals around how this could be made legal. Can the churches designate the tenants as, say, youth ministers to get around requirements?
Maybe they could try, but I don't think
it's pretty hard when you're
work.
collecting rent, market rate rent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. It's not like Sammi said, it's not like we're approaching anything like a charitable purpose. It's just a bunch of apartments that are being charged market rate rent.
Yeah, like they're just students attending college who need a place to live, and 10% of renters don't have to be students. So there could be a small handful of renters that are also just people who live and work here and who clearly are not ministers.
Because again, it's an apartment building.
Yeah.
So it's more the purpose that the building is being used for, and there's really no recharacterizing that. Okay. How long do lawsuits like this take? We kind of alluded to that. We're in the very, very, very preliminary stages of this lawsuit, and it probably will take months, if not years, to be resolved. But hopefully within 6 months, there will be some preliminary movement in the case.
Yeah. I'd expect like some kind of preliminary ruling before the end of the year, but then of course, like,
you never know.
Depending on who appeals or how many appeals, it can go on for a long time.
How do Dan and Annie Laurie have standing in this?
So Dan and Annie Laurie, they own a home here in Madison. They own their house and they pay property taxes on it like other homeowners do, and that is how they have standing as residents and taxpayers of Madison, because, like we said, removing these properties from the tax rolls means that they and everyone else here who pays property taxes have been paying more every year to make up for that.
Mm-hmm. If the lawsuit is won, what would happen after that?
So we are seeking what's called a declaratory judgment, which basically just asks the court to declare that this law is unconstitutional under our state constitution for the reasons we're arguing. And generally, if a statute like this is declared unconstitutional, then it is just unenforceable and struck down. Like, the court is not supposed to do the legislature's job and come up with a way to rewrite the law to make it okay. They'll just strike all or part of the law that's declared unconstitutional, right. And then if the legislature wants to try again, they are welcome to do that.
Yep. If the law were struck down, we would expect the city to put those properties back on the tax rolls unless some other action is taken to try and exempt them again. But we will just put our heads down and do the long work of litigating the case to that point, and hopefully this lawsuit raises some awareness in the community about these exemptions. I think most property owners would be surprised to learn that 2 prime pieces of downtown real estate investment property are tax exempt at the cost of, higher taxes for all of us. And so we're hoping that taxpayers in our community are sort of made aware of this special privilege and the unfairness, and also that the courts will do right by Madison taxpayers and strike this down.
Yeah.
So I think we'll leave it there. Watch this space, and we will bring updates on this case as the year goes on and the lawsuit progresses. Thank you for watching. That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with Amanda Tyler. She's the founder of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She has a new book out. Here's a little sample.
I think some of that idea comes from a false claim of persecution. This idea that somehow that the Christian majority in this country has a right to have laws and policies that reflect Christian beliefs. And that, again, is just simply not in line with the U.S. Constitution or the way that our government has been set up. And so when there is a sense that the government stays neutral, that is, I think, perceived by some as a sign of hostility, when in fact, it really is just creating an even playing field for everyone.
You'll be able to watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend and soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio and wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers, including me, discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org. And finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. And if not, please join us. We will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.